day 2 of fun employment for me, so as promised, here's some bread talk. Maybe like me, you work in the events industry or the hospitality sector, and your diary's gone from looking pretty full to being completely empty overnight. Maybe you're self-isolating, maybe you're working from home, maybe it's months away from now and everything's gone back to normal and you just fancy learning about some bread, and hey, this is on the internet, so it's on the internet forever. Either way, we're going to learn a little bit today about some equipment that we need to make some bread. Don't need very much equipment to make bread at home. You're going to need something to measure or weigh our ingredients out with. I really like using digital scales because they're accurate down to about a gram, which means they're really useful for weighing out smaller quantity ingredients like salt and yeast, where precision is kind of a little bit more important. If you've got mechanical scales, they're really only accurate to about 10 or 20 grams, which is fine for flour. It's not so good for yeast, obviously, so just use teaspoons to measure your yeast and salt if you're using mechanical scales. You can measure your liquid ingredients using a measuring jug or cup. I prefer to weigh my ingredients, liquid and dry, just because it's a bit more accurate again. So we've got something to measure our ingredients with. We're going to want something to mix our dough in. So here I've got a mixing bowl, a little bit of sourdough in it that's proofing. Obviously a mixing bowl is a great bowl for mixing in, the clue's in the name. But if you don't have one of those, crack out your biggest salad bowl. If we're having to go a little bit more MacGyver, clean out your washing up bowl, use your casserole, anything that's food safe and clean will be fine. So we've mixed a batch of dough, now we need to knead it. So we're going to knead stuff on our worktop, which means we want something to help us get the dough out of the mixing bowl and to help us get the dough off the worktop as we're kneading the dough, and finally something to scale the dough or cut it into the right size portions for our loaves. So we've got some of these dough scrapers. The ones with curved edges, they're really useful for getting dough out of bowls because it means you can get all the way into the bowl. They're a little bit trickier for cutting dough with. That's where these guys sort of come into their own. One note of caution, these metal ones, they'll scrape up wooden worktops really well. So if you've got expensive oak worktops in your fancy kitchen, maybe avoid using this, maybe stick to the plastic one. If you don't have a dough scraper, I appreciate it might be something that not everyone has kicking around in their kitchen. Dig around in your kitchen drawers, maybe you've got a plastic spatula that's relatively stiff, that'll do the job just fine. Grab a fish slice, it'll be fine for cutting your dough when you're scaling. It's going to be a little bit more unwieldy as a dough scraper, but it'll do the job in a pinch. If we need to go the full MacGyver because we're stuck at home for 2 weeks and we just desperately want to make some dough, pick out your least favourite DVD from your DVD collection. It's a redundant technology now anyway, and Evolution with David Duchovny and Seann William Scott wasn't a very good film when it was released. It's an even worse film now, so I don't feel any guilt about using that as a scraper. Obviously it's probably not food safe, it probably contains heaps of BPA, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as the first choice, but hey, we're having to be a little bit creative now, we're quarantined. So there we've got our scrapers, we've formed our dough, we've scaled it, which just means we've cut it to the size that we want, or weight rather, that we want our loaf to be. Now we need to cook our loaf. If you've got a loaf pan, obviously that's a great way to make something that looks like a loaf of bread. If you don't, you can make it into a ball shape or a French boule, or maybe some baguettes, in which case you're going to want to cook it just on a baking tray. Comme ça. Any old baking tray will do. And then if you're after something that looks a little bit more like something you might drop £8 on at Borough Market, your cast iron casserole is a really good way of getting a sort of bakery quality loaf out of a domestic oven, because it means you'll be able to get an environment a lot more like a commercial steam oven in a domestic oven. So your fan oven It's not a great environment to create a moisture-rich, hot space where your dough can rise, where you can get a good amount of oven spring. It's much better if you can put your dough in a little hot chamber like this, and then the water that's evaporating from your dough will make a nice steamy environment inside the casserole, and then the crust of your loaf won't set too soon, so your bread can continue rising. It will get a really good oven spring before the crust sets. If your crust sets too soon in the bake process, then what tends to happen is it will crack and split in a slightly ugly way as the bread continues to rise, or worse still, if it sets really well and really quickly, your dough won't rise enough. You'll lose all your oven spring and you'll end up with a very dense loaf. So these things are great. If you've got one of those, then that's cool. So that's pretty much all the equipment we need, other than something to cut your loaf with after you've finished, and also I guess slash your loaf before it goes in the oven to give it that kind of nice artisanal look. A serrated bread knife is great for slashing loaves before they go in the oven, and obviously for cutting bread. Clues in the name.